Hi. Excuse me. Here we are reading The Silver Chair. Last time we got as far as um, Jill and Scrub talking to each other there in Narnia and watching the old king, get on board the ship uh, and sail away. And then an owl came and talked to them and brought them to Trumpkin, who is a dwarf who is sort of the Lord Regent of, or something like that. He's in charge of the castle while the king's gone. And finally, even though uh, Trumpkin is nearly deaf, he finds out that Aslan had sent them. And so he invites them to come to the castle and tells the owl, Glimfeather is his name, the owl, to make sure that uh, they go to they see their rooms where they're going to stay and that they have a chance to clean up. Okay, so we'll go on from there. They, that is Jill and Scruff and Glimfeather, they went across the lawn and then through an orchard and so to the north gate of Cair Paravel. Cair Paravel is a castle, which stood the gate which stood wide open. Inside they found a grassy courtyard. Lights were already showing from the windows of the great hall on their right, and from a more complicated mass of buildings straight ahead. Into these the owl led them. And there a most delightful person was called to look after Jill. She was not much taller than Jill herself, and a good deal more slender, but obviously full grown, graceful as a willow, and her hair was willowy too, and there seemed to be moss in it. She brought Jill to a round room in one of the turrets, where there was a little bath sunk in the floor, and a fire of sweet smelling woods burning on the flat hearth, and a lamp hanging by a silver chain from the vaulted roof. The window looked west into the strange land of Narnia, and Jill saw the red mountains of the sunset still glowing behind distant mountains. It made her long for more adventures and feel sure that this was only the beginning. When she had had her bath and brushed her hair and put on the clothes that had been laid out for her, they were the kind that not only felt nice, but looked nice and smelled nice and made nice sounds when you moved as well. She would have gone back to gaze out of that exciting window, but she was interrupted by a bang on the door. "Come in," said Jill, and in came Scrub, also bathed and splendidly dressed in Narnian clothes, but his face didn't look as if he were enjoying it. "Oh, here you are at last," he said crossly, flinging himself into a chair. "I've been trying to find you for ever so long." "Well, now you have," said Jill. "I say, Scrub, isn't it all simply too exciting and scrumptious for words?" She had forgotten all about the signs and the lost prince for the moment. And then, after a pause, "I wish to goodness we had never come." "Why on earth?" "I can't bear it," said Scrub. "Seeing the king, Caspian, a doddering old man like that. It's frightful." "Why? What harm does it do you?" "Oh, you don't understand. Now that I come to think of it, you couldn't. I didn't tell you that this world has a different time from ours." "How do you mean?" "The time you spend here doesn't take up any of our time. Do you see? I mean, however long we spend here, we shall get back to Experiment House at the moment we left it." "That won't be much fun." "Oh, dry up. Don't keep interrupting. And when you're back in England, in our world, you can't tell how time is going here. It might be any number of years in Narnia while we're having 1 year at home. The Peevinishes explained all that to me." The Peevinishes are Lucy and Peter and Edmund and Susan. the four children who first got into Narnia. They explained it all to me, but like a fool, I forgot about it. And now apparently it's been about 70 years, Narnian years, since I was here last. Do you see now? And I come back and find Caspian an old, old man. Then the king was an old friend of yours, said Jill. A horrid thought had struck her. I should jolly well think he was, said Scrub miserably. About as good a friend as a chap could have, and last time he was only a few years older than me. And to see that old man with a white beard, and to remember Caspian as he was the morning we captured the Lone Islands, or the fight with the sea serpent, oh, it's frightful. It's worse than coming back and finding him dead. Oh, shut up, said Jill impatiently. It's far worse than you think. We've muffed the first sign. Of course, Scrub didn't understand this. Then Jill told him about her conversation with Aslan and the four signs and the task of finding the lost prince, which had been laid upon them. So you see, she wound up, you did see an old friend, just as Aslan said, and you ought to have gone and spoken to him at once. And now you haven't, and everything is going wrong from the very beginning. But how was I to know, said Scrub. If you had only listened to me when I was trying to tell you, we'd be all right, said Jill. Yes, and if you hadn't played the fool on the edge of the cliff and jolly nearly murdered me. All right, I said murder, and I'll say it again as often as I like, so keep your hair on. We'd have come together and both known what to do. I suppose he was the very first person you saw, said Jill. You must have been here hours before me. Are you sure you didn't see anyone else first? I was only here about a minute before you, said Scrub. He must have blown you quicker than me, making up for lost time, the time you lost. You notice how they're both blaming each other for things going wrong. That's a very human and not very nice thing to do, always to put blame on other people instead of admitting that maybe you had something to do with things going wrong. Uh, and as I was just reading, Eustace said, he must have blown you quicker than me, making up for lost time, the time that you lost. Don't be a perfect beast, Scrub, said Jill. Hello, what's that? It was the castle bell ringing for supper, and thus what looked like turning into a first-rate quarrel was happily cut short. Both had a good appetite by this time. Supper in the great hall of the castle was the most splendid thing either of them had ever seen, for though Eustace had been in that world before, he had spent his whole time at sea and knew nothing of the glory and courtesy of the Narnians at home in their own land. The banners hung from the roof, and each course came in with trumpeters and kettle drums. There were soups that would make your mouth water to think of, and the lovely fishes called pavenders, and venison and peacock, and pies and ices and jellies, and fruit and nuts, and all manner of wines and fruit cakes. Even Eustace cheered up and admitted that it was something like. And when all the serious eating and drinking was over, a blind poet came forward and struck up a grand old tale of Prince Cor and Aravis, the horse Bree, which is called The Horse and His Boy, and tells of an adventure that happened in Narnia and Calormen in the lands between in the Golden Age, when Peter was High King of Cair Paravel. I haven't time to tell it now, though it is well worth hearing. Well, that book, The Horse and His Boy, is another book in the Chronicles of Narnia, and we haven't read it yet, but we'll get to it sooner or later. But in this case, after dinner, there is a poet who, as they're sitting around after the dinner, there's a poet who is telling that story. When they were dragging themselves upstairs to bed, yawning their heads off, Jill said, I bet we sleep well tonight, for it had been a full day, which just shows how little anyone knows what is going to happen to them next. Now, that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 is called A Parliament of Owls, and I'm going to begin reading chapter 4. Now, remember that they were just ready to go to bed and they were very tired, for it had been a long day. It is a very funny thing that the sleepier you are, the longer you take about getting to bed, especially if you are lucky enough to have a fire in your room. Jill felt she couldn't even start undressing unless she sat down in front of the fire for a bit first. And once she had sat down, she didn't want to get up again. She had already said to herself about 5 times, I must go to bed. When she had said that about 5 times, when she was startled by a tap on the window. She got up, pulled the curtain, and at first saw nothing but darkness. Then she jumped and started backwards, for something very large had dashed itself against the window, giving a sharp tap on the glass as it did so. A very unpleasant idea came into her head. Suppose they have giant moths in this country. Ugh! But then the thing came back, and this time she was almost sure she saw a beak, and that the beak had made the tapping noise. It's some huge bird, thought Jill. Could it be an eagle? She didn't very much want a visit from even from an eagle, but she opened the window and looked out, and instantly, with a great whirring noise, the creature alighted on the windowsill and stood there, filling up the whole window, so that Jill had to step back and make room for it. It was an owl. Hush, hush, to hoo, said the owl. Don't make a noise. Now you are too really in earnest about what you've got to do. Or, I didn't read that right. He says, now are you two really in earnest about what you've got to do? About the lost prince, you mean? Said Jill. Yes, we've got to be. For now she remembered that the lion's voice and face, which she had nearly forgotten during the feasting, and the storytelling in the hall. She remembered the lion's face. Good, said the owl. Then there's no time to waste. You must get away from here at once. I'll go and wake the other human. Then I'll come back for you. You'd better change those court clothes and put on something you can travel in. I'll be back in 2 twos. Too-hoo. And without waiting for an answer, he was gone. If Jill had been more used to adventures, she might have doubted the owl's word, but this never occurred to her. And in the exciting idea of a midnight escape, she forgot her sleepiness. She changed back into sweater and shorts. There was a guide's knife on the belt of the shorts, which might come in useful, and added a few of the things that had been left in the room for her by the girl with the willowy hair. She chose a short cloak that came down to her knees and had a hood. Just the thing if it rained, she thought. And she also chose a few handkerchiefs and a comb. Then she sat down and waited. She was getting sleepy again when the owl returned. Now we're ready, it said. You'd better lead the way, said Jill. I don't know all these passages yet. To who? Said the owl. We're not going through the castle. That would never do. You must ride on me. We shall fly. Oh, said Jill, and stood with her mouth open, not much liking the idea. Shan't I be far too heavy for you? To who? Don't you be a fool. I've already carried the other one. Now, but we'll put out that lamp first. As soon as the lamp was out, the bit of the night which you saw through the window looked less dark, no longer black, but gray. The owl stood on the windowsill with his back to the room and raised his wings. Jill had to climb onto his short, fat body and get her knees under the wings and grip tight. The feathers felt beautifully warm and soft, but there was nothing to hold on by. I wonder how Scrub liked this ride, thought Jill. And just as she was thinking this, with a horrid plunge, they had left the windowsill, and the wings were making a flurry round her ears, and the night air, rather cool and damp, was flying in her face. It was much lighter than she expected, and though the sky was overcast, one patch of watery silver showed where the moon was hiding above the clouds. The fields beneath her looked gray, and the trees black. There was a certain amount of wind, a hushing, ruffling sort of wind, which meant that rain was coming soon. The owl wheeled round so that the castle was now ahead of them. Very few of its windows showed lights. They flew right over it, northwards, crossing the river, and the air grew colder, and Jill thought she could see the white reflection of the owl in the water beneath her. But soon they were on the north bank of the river, flying above the wooded country. The owl snapped at something which Jill couldn't see. "Oh, don't, please," said Jill. "Don't jerk like that. You nearly threw me off." "Oh, I beg your pardon," said the owl. "I was just nabbing a bat. There's nothing so sustaining in a small way as a nice plump little bat. Shall I catch one for you?" "No, thanks," said Jill with a shudder. He was flying a little lower now, and a large black looking object was looming up towards them. Jill had just time to see that it was a tower, a partly ruinous tower with a lot of ivy on it, she thought. Then, when she found herself ducking, to avoid the archway of the window as the owl squeezed with her through the ivied and cobwebby opening, out of the fresh gray night into the dark place inside the top tower. So they flew into a dark opening in this old tower. It was rather fusty inside, and the moment she slipped off the owl's back, she knew, as one usually does somehow, that it was quite crowded. And when the voices began saying out of the darkness from every direction, "To-hoo, to-hoo," she knew it was crowded with owls. She was rather relieved when a different voice said, "Is that you, Pole? Is that you, Scrub?" said Jill. "Now," said Glimfeather, "I think we're all here. Let's hold a parliament of owls." Well, I'm going to stop right there. So, in this part of this story, um, Jill and Scrub, or Pole and Scrub, Jill is sometimes called Jill and sometimes Pole, and Eustace is sometimes called Eustace and sometimes he is called Scrub. They both went to a feast in the castle, and it was a wonderful feast. And then they went back to their rooms and were visited by an owl, Glimfeather, who carried them off to this old ruin. And inside, it turns out there were many owls. And now Glimfeather says they're going to have a parliament of owls. A parliament is sort of like a gathering together for discussion. Well, we'll find out next time what the owls are going to talk about and how that might affect Jill and Eustace. That's it for today. I've enjoyed reading to you. Bye now.